heads up. Um, so we are very, very lucky to be hosting this as Dark Opacities Lab. And so my name is Balbir K. Singh. I'm the director of Dark Opacities Lab, which is a hub for BIPOC aesthetic and political study and strategy. And this is our first event of the winter 2025 semester. So it's a very auspicious moment for us to be engaging two brilliant people, such as Cosmo and Abigail. And we are very, very excited to speak a bit about the project that they've done for this gallery, and we're very excited to be in conversation today. We will hear a little bit from each of them about the project and take a look at some of the works, especially for those. I know there's many folks who are like not local, so it'll be great to sort of have that insight and the sort of visuals to pair with how to sort of think and frame this really, really brilliant project. So let me properly introduce both Cosmo and Abigail. So Cosmo Whyte is an assistant professor in the School of Arts and Architecture at the University of California, Los Angeles. Whyte uses drawing, sculpture, and installation to explore the intersections of racialization, nationalism, and displacement. For Whyte, the archive is both a threshold and a site of disruption that he uses for his artistic practice. And next, Abigail E. Celis is an assistant professor of art history and museology at the Université de Montréal. Trained in cultural studies, she is interested in the survivals of colonialism and decolonial imaginaries in visual culture, artistic practice, and museum norms in contemporary Francophone contexts with a focus on France and Senegal. So thank you both so much for being here. I wanted to also just read from the description of the exhibition, just to give a little bit of context, and then I will hand it off to Abigail and Cosmo to have us take a look at some of the project. And so a little bit on the catalog of speculative translations. It's part of a larger project that critically examines the exhibition in French museums of objects removed from African material culture. The Catalog of Speculative Translations, Act Two, Fugitivities, creates escapes from the architecture where colonial captures are locked up, thereby short-circuiting the museological apparatus that, through its sampling, labeling, and imposed knowledge, seizes human lives and material bodies. Act Two, Fugitivities, is intended as a response to the Musée d'Art Africains, Océaniens, Amerindiens in Marseille, located in a building that once served as a transit center and infirmary for soldiers seconded to or recruited in the French colonies. The objects held in the MAAOA, like the men who preceded them, were called upon to serve the French colonial empire both economically and in terms of representations. Considering that museums and archives are places of erasure, the catalog invents strategies of obfuscation, repetition, fabulation, translation, and transposition. It is a question of reviving memories and knowledge specific to diasporas that are at the heart of the practices of fugitivity, this flight towards places of possibility still unknown. And this not with the aim of making visible what has been erased, but in the hope of creating new zones of sensory and narrative opacity. So I'm very thrilled to be able to hear a bit from the two of them. And also just, reading that in the context of seeing the exhibition, just the brilliance of the project. And I'm very excited to learn from you both today. So I will let you now both share the slides and describe a bit of the project.
Thanks so much, Balbir, for the invitation. Cosmo and I are really delighted to be in conversation with you. I'm going to start sharing the screen. A lot of this talk will be a conversation, but we thought it would make sense to kind of start with some context, especially for those of you who may not have seen the exhibition. And so, as Balbir mentioned, this exhibition, Act Two, is part of a larger project. We can talk about that earlier iteration in more detail later, but for now, I'll just say that it started with this question that I had as I was doing research in museums in France when and I was asking myself, and in different ways, Cosmo was also asking this question of what are we looking at when we see collections of African art of the historical canon in museum spaces in the West, and more particularly for me in France? Because museums place this premium on the authenticity of objects, right? They're supposed to be these authentic creations, authentic witnesses to a particular culture. But how much can we trust or believe that claim to authenticity when the objects, beings, and ancestors that are being exhibited have gone through material, semantic, and interpretive manipulations as they travel across cultural contexts and often in through colonial relations. So I was asking myself, what is what we're looking at not original objects but translations? So, in what ways do museums um, use translation explicitly or implicitly in the way they present their collections? So, I really wanted to interrogate this relationship of translation and the power dynamics that are held in a relationship of translation, because we talk about assimilative translation, we talk about literal translation, we talk about translation along the spectrum of appropriation and exchange. Um, and so um, I decided that this was something that I really wanted to think about in dialogue with someone else, and especially in dialogue with someone who wasn't necessarily using the same research methods or ways of producing knowledge that I was. And that's why I invited Cosmo to think about this question with me. And as we began discussing uh, this idea of translation in museums, one thing that came up very quickly was the idea not only of translation as something that's inherently inscribed in power dynamics, but also the power of translation as a practice of speculation, of fabulation, of creating fiction and narrative. Um, and we were particularly interested in the speculative power of translation because we were also thinking about these museum collections in France in 2016 at a moment when the question of repatriation and restitution was foreclosed. It was completely off the table. There's a whole set of legal apparatus in France that made it seem that it would never be possible. So for us, if the collections that we were looking at were not going to escape the museum physically, if they were going to stay where they were, was there a way to not only interrogate the translation that was happening in that space, but use translation as part of, as a way to experience moments of escape or to imagine different futures for the objects, beings, and ancestors that were held in the museum? So we'll talk more, or we can talk more later about what that first iteration looked like, but what it left us with after that first collaboration was a set of questions related both to kind of concept certain concepts, to certain materials, and to one site. So the theoretical concepts that emerged out of that first experimentation was the way that translation was related to three ideas in particular. The idea of repetition, so thinking of the fact that translation is really repetition in another language, right? You're taking something that has already been said and you're saying it again, but in a different language. And we often think of repetition as a mechanism for clarity and for authority. So we repeat something to make sure we're understood if there's a doubt that something was not quite captured the first time we said it. And we repeat things to emphasize, to kind of ascribe more power to them. But we were wondering, but we were also interested in this tension where repetition can become a way of obscuring or confusing or kind of superposing so many things that you lose, you don't add clarity, but you add layers or complexities. Um, we were thinking about the relationship between translation and opacity, of course, with this idea of things that are untranslatable or lost in translation. And so how translation might be a process that um, creates zones of opacity, that creates zones of intimacy, zones of privacy, especially in a space like the museum that is so much about exposure and explanation. And then, and this was particularly important for Cosmo as well, the relationship between translation and fugitivity. Um, Again, we can think of how translation is often talked about. We talk about translation as treason, right? Something that gets betrayed in the process of translation because of those things that are lost. But maybe treason is useful in a space of kind of nation state and colonial captivity. So can translation unsettle relationships of power even have and create lines of flight, even as it's part of kind of the structures that created the captivity in the first place. And materially, we were interested in what translation looks like when it's moving across different medium material and materials and media. So what does translating something between still images and moving images, or in that space between still and moving images, what would that look like? What would it look like to translate things across uh, image, drawing, video, text, uh, oral or sonic materials and tactile materials. And what does it mean to translate across senses as well? So things that we see, what are ways to translate them into things that we hear or touch or feel or even taste? Um, and then so we had these kind of theoretical and material interrogations, and we had a site that we hadn't worked with before that captured our attention as well, which is this museum that Balbir mentioned in her intro, which is a museum of what's called African, Oceanic, and Amerindian art. It's a literal translation from French, kind of very typical of museums that you see in France when a lot of non-European um, material objects are placed in the same museum. And many of these objects that were initially presented in the context of ethnographic museums and are now being presented in the context of something that's between an ethnographic museum and an art museum. This museum is located in Marseille. It drew our attention because it used a lot of the same kind of museum display techniques we had seen elsewhere, in that it was a gallery that was quite dark. There was no natural light that came in. Um, the artificial light inside was quite dim. There were a lot of vitrines. So most of the objects were displayed behind plexiglass, either along the wall or in standalone cases. And this also created a space with a lot of reflection. So it is actually quite hard to see some of the objects sometimes because this contrast between the bright spotlights, the dark room, and the plexiglass made it that you were kind of seeing reflections more than the objects themselves. And there was a lot of text, a lot of, talk about ethnic groups, about colonial divisions, etc. So it had a lot of the museological trends we saw elsewhere, but condensed in this small space. And it was located in this in this building that had a really interesting history because it was built in the 17th century as a kind of hospice and space for unhoused people. But that was also kind of a carceral space in that the people who ended up being cared for in there were sometimes institutionalized, right? They didn't choose to go there for care. They were pushed into that space. Um, and then in the 20th century, as Balbir mentioned, it served as a transit center for colonial troops of France's army. So troops that were either being deployed to France's colonial territories or troops of men who were being recruited from France's colonial territories. and particularly in World War I, were being kind of passed through there to go to the front lines to fight alongside the front European teams. So it was a really interesting site of both captivity and care, or care as captivity, um, that kind of tied this diaspora of people and of objects in the same place. So it seemed like a site that would be really interesting to interrogate and investigate. Um, as you see here, it's the entrance to this building when it served as the transit center for colonial troops. So I think now I'll turn it to Cosmo, and we'll start kind of doing a kind of virtual tour through photographs of the exhibition that we created from the research that we did on this site.
Okay. Can you go to the next slide? So central to the exhibition is this large beaded curtain, and it's painted black, but it has a shimmering quality to it. And projected onto the beaded curtain is this video piece that was created from our time or field work in Marseille. So in 2019, Abigail and I were in residence at the Carmago Foundation, and we would make regular trips. We were there specifically to do the field work for this project, and we would make regular trips in there. And um, I was fascinated by the space. I was particularly interested in the ways in which the camera was always at odds with how dark the interior of the space was. So it was constantly battling and negotiating that. And then I opted to shoot around the museum space, and then Marseille as well, thinking about Marseille as the shipping port and that that history as well. So what you're looking at is the video projected onto this beaded curtain, and beaded curtains have been a medium that I've been exploring since 2019. And in previous works, the curtains are painted with archival imagery on it, and the viewer, and then placed in thresholds within the museum space, and it demands that the viewer walk or interact with it. Due to the architecture of this space, that interaction is not as is not as forced. It's more of a contemplative space. But what was nice that occurred from this installation is the doubling of the image that happens here. This kind of repetition, and it creates this kind of shadow effect to the work. Can you move to the next slide? So here's a close-up of the beads, and the shimmering of the beads also are in conversation with other pieces throughout the show. So it's important that we talk about the curtain first, because by talking about the curtain, we can start to understand the other pieces within the show. This was a new way of working for me, where the curtain became central, and all of the other pieces were kind of built from the process of creating the curtain works. And we'll get more into that as we go along. Can you go to the next one? Yeah. So, here you get a sense. And if you stop sharing for a second, Abby, I will share a video of the potential interactions with the curtain. Okay. So here you get a sense of the movement within the work. What's interesting with this iteration, in order for you to see what is being projected clearly, it requires for you to move the curtain, as you briefly saw with Abigail moving it right here. That's the only way to see what's being projected clearly. So the curtain also acts as a layer of opacity, or as a way of obscuring or um, masking the image. You can go back to sharing. And then next slide. Yeah. Okay. So now this moment. So um, while filming within the space, there was a moment. There was a moment where I was every day. It was responding to a new set of challenges, and on this particular day, the focus was in. I purposely didn't want to focus on the objects themselves, and instead, I was interested in the ways in which the lighting would cast shadows of the objects across the floors of the museum space. Um, and this particular one became central. And there was this really beautiful moment in the film where a visitor of the museum walks across the shadow. And this became a motif that is repeated throughout the exhibition. Um, yeah. And as we were working on the different components of the exhibition, uh, we together came up with these set of questions that kind of contextualize the ways in which we were attempting to engage with the materials and the archives. Let me take it.
Okay. Um, so continue talking about, and I should have said at the beginning, in the exhibition that we created, there's kind of four main installations. And so Cosmo just talked about the curtain installation that has a short film that we created, projected on it. That's footage captured within the museum exhibition, as he mentioned, but also the neighborhood, as well as images. Um, from archives that we found that spoke to the history of the building or to some of the people who passed through it. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we were interested in kind of translating across mediums and this idea of images that are both still and in motion, which we captured or we tried to convey a bit through the video installation by using very close-up shots, as Cosmo mentioned, also to not explicitly show the objects in the space because these are objects that we don't know if they consented to be there. We don't know if the people who made them consented for them to be there. So we try to, as Cosmo mentioned, focus more on filming their shadows or filming close-ups or filming out of focus. So we used kind of blurring in and out of focus as a way to, while holding the camera still, having these really still shots, but adding movement through the um, focus blur dynamic. And then we explored this relationship of stillness, movement, repetition, opacity, fugitivity through a slide projector installation as well, which is what you see on the screen. Um, Again, we used a combination of stills taken from the film footage and archival images that we found. So here you see how Cosmo has taken that motif of the shadow and its reflection from footage of the film and layered it over an image of a few soldiers that are standing in front of the entrance of the building when it served as a transit center for colonial troops. And again, he was very careful about kind of cropping or layering images um, to again create zones of opacity, intimacy, and privacy. So the shadow actually obscures the faces of the people who are in this photograph, who again, we don't know who they are, and we don't have a way of asking them or their descendants if they're okay with being shown. So we wanted to both evoke the traces of this past, but in a way that is hopefully still allowing for privacy and intimacy in the individual stories that make up this past. So these are some of the images that we created, and here's um, uh, uh, excuse me, the slide projected on the wall. We projected directly on the wall. So in this one, the images are a bit clearer than on the screen. But again, with all of the kind of repetition and layering of images, um, we try to always have this idea of opacity and texture in the image showed as well. And we inserted some slides where we asked these questions that emerged through the process of the project to give visitors, if they stay and see some of the questions roll by, some prompts to think with us. Because it's one of, by making this choice of using abstraction, we're also not allowing a lot of easy entry points for visitors. And so inserting some of the questions was a way to give some clues into our thought process and kind of the concerns that we had, that visitors can choose to take up or not, or choose to engage in the materials according to their own experiences and histories and knowledges, and of course create their own narratives from it. So these are more examples of kind of the juxtaposition of archival image and footage from within the museum space. And as you've hopefully noticed, as I've kind of gone through these slides, the shadow keeps popping up across different locations. And that's because as Cosmo created the images for the slides, and we discussed them and created a sequence for them, um, what he tried to do was convey this idea of escape. So the first time you encounter the shadow, it's within this exhibition space of the museum, and slowly you see it starting to appear still within the building, but no longer in the exhibition space, in the stairwell or in the courtyard. And then you start seeing it appear in neighborhood streets in Marseille. And then towards the end of the slide sequence, there's 78 slides. Towards the end of the sequence, you see it in the ocean, um, which could be a beginning or, could be the next step, or it could be kind of a flashback to how this object got there in the first place through these transient, transient, transient oceanic, excuse me, movements. And I'll let you.
So as I mentioned before, this was a new way of working, very much still in dialogue with my practice. But what I really enjoyed about from the first iteration of this project to the second one was that it really opened up the space for me to experiment, but also particularly with this one, it really felt like um, I was thinking out loud and inviting the viewer. Well, both of us were thinking out loud and inviting the viewer in a way that also felt quite vulnerable. So you can go to the next slide. These collages are all process based, which is very different. Well, there's some process based works within my practice, but for the process to be so prominent is new for me. And it was also a way of being, while working with archival images, but being less reliant on the photographic image, to allowing the work to fall into abstraction and using abstraction as a mode of opacity and as a mode of escape. So we can go to the next slide. So there's a combination, and I must add, within all of this, you can see the beads, traces of the beads. So this paper was used um, in the process of creating the curtain. So we're seeing traces of the beads um, as the paint is hitting them, creating these shadows or negative spaces, and then using that patterns and leaning into that to create these modes of abstraction. And then there's a number of different processes, but always keeping the questions in the forefront, the questions that Abigail and I were thinking through, these questions that Abigail, crafted and would pose to both of us, keeping those in the forefront as I'm making the work. You can go to the next slide. And then hanging the work also became a conversation both between Abigail and myself, and then the museum. And one solution came to was using magnets so that the work wouldn't be framed. And it became one of those happy acts, or not accident, but this kind of really generative moment when realizing that the magnets themselves could be used as a form of mark making, as a form of abstraction, and not just as the apparatus to hold the work. Yeah. And then within this, particularly this piece, it's a way of connecting to the annotations that are present both in the Abigail's annotations of the translations, but also in the cards that Abigail will talk about shortly. And always within the context of the exhibition, thinking about how each piece is talking to one another in both subtle and overt ways. And what is the viewer's experience of walking through the space, and how they can see the ways in which we're thinking across these different mediums. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna very briefly go back
Yeah.
to something you said, Cosmo, that I think is really interesting and important. So as you was talking about, when we hung these drawings in the gallery space using these round magnets, it's just a very typical way to hang unframed work, right?
Mhm.
And as we were hanging that, noticing that there was a lot of repetition or resonance or doubling between the kind of shape and the reflection of these small magnets and the beads of the curtain. But it was also really interesting. So Cosmo decided to incorporate them more explicitly, as you see in these drawings where he started putting magnets kind of throughout the drawing. But I found that really interesting as well, because as we were kind of interrogating the Marseille Museum exhibition space, we were really interested in all of the museological apparatus, so the display cases, the stands, the sound of the air conditioning or dehumidifiers, or all of these kind of mechanical things that keep the objects in place. And so it is really interesting to see Cosmo take something else that's kind of used to keep drawings in place and incorporate them into the artwork itself. Um, and yeah, as you mentioned, oops, sorry, um, and so as he mentioned, kind of as a companion to these drawings, we also reprinted the text labels that I had translated, that I had collected from the Marseille Museum, as well as some other museums in France, and I had translated them into English and sent the translations to Cosmo. And so he was also reading these translated texts as he was fabricating the drawings. And then in the exhibition space, we decided to display those texts would cover them with this vellum paper that's semi-transparent. You can read better than you can in the photos here. When you're in the exhibition space, you can kind of make out the text behind it. But by annotating the vellum paper, what you see more are my annotations, which are questions that I posed that I initially thought would be questions that I'd be kind of asking the museum. But as I was doing the annotations, I realized I had more questions for the objects. And so this became a way to kind of, again, use speculative mode to think about what are the conversations I wish I could have with these objects, and what can they tell us about where they are, where they've been, where they could be, and what kind of futures they imagine as possible. And this idea of annotation also links to the idea of citation, which is the last installation space or installation that we have in the gallery space, a card catalog drawer in which we put we filled three drawers. One drawer has the questions that we had asked through the film and through the slide projector, alongside quotations from things that we read that were kind of our companion pieces as we discussed and as we experimented and as we researched. And they're in this card catalog format, which allows for mobility. So I did pick a sequence for them. I would put like some quotations next to questions that kind of emerged from those citations, or that the citations were potential answers to. But of course, it's a card catalog, so you can move things around and make different connections between them. And then there's a drawer with simply our references. So every one we cited in the quotation, in through quotation, is in that drawer. Also people that we cited in the titles of the installations. We didn't talk too much about them. We can talk about them in the Q&A if desired. But we often reference specific authors or concepts in the titles of the installation pieces. And then the third drawer was the arrow drawer, because these cards I typed up with the mechanical typewriter, which of course is not like a word processing document on a computer. When I do a typo or misread and thus misquote something, I can't just delete and start over. I have to throw out the card and begin with a new card. Except I didn't throw out the cards. I kept them all and kept them in the arrow drawer to kind of document again this kind of process that Cosmo was talking about, making very visible the process of thinking, the process of learning, and also the kind of process of making mistakes along the way. I'm going to stop there because we intended to be much shorter in this virtual tour, and I'd love to get the more dialogic part of this, but I will drop in the chat uh, a link to a video recording of a guided tour that we did in the exhibition space. If anyone wants to see in more detail the exhibition or hear us talk about it in more detail, you're welcome to consult that.
Well, thank you both. That was incredibly like it also just like I think going in for me into the exhibition, like hearing this afterward, it is incredibly helpful because, getting into like the process-based portion, the collaging, like and like when I was very obsessed with like the little tiny magnets, and I was like, okay, just so there's some clarity as someone who is very much invested in opacity, I was like the clarity of like having some answers to questions, just like technically, I was like, oh, this is so generative. I also want to say, I really like just on a personal note the ca card catalog portion. I really enjoyed. I my first part-time job when I was 16 was at a public library, and it was like this turn from the analog card catalog to everything going digital, like early aughts moment. And I just was very, I don't know. It made me very excited to see the card catalog, this physical sort of like, and then just the ability to like just get super curious and get into the work that you all provided in that. There are like a million more questions I have, but I also want to be very conscious of time. So um, I did want to ask a question. I mean, and maybe we can, I'll kind of jump around a little bit more just for the sake of time. But I did want to hear, maybe we can start with that sort of question of like, given that this is Act Two, I would love to know a little bit more about what Act One, how you guys developed sort of this collaborative process. Really broadly speaking, you're in two very physically, just very geographically separate places. So I'm very curious about yeah, just how things came about for you both, and also how this project relates to your respective practices creatively, as well as your research. So I know that's a bunch of questions in one, but I'd love to just sort of hear about the background and sort of like how it came to be and how this collaboration started to happen and what it looked like for this this particular exhibition too in this iteration.
Do you want to start or do you want me to start, Cosmo?
You could start and then I can jump in.
Okay. So maybe to talk, well, say something very brief about kind of my research background and interests. So my training is in French and Francophone studies, and my interest is in the afterlives of colonialism and visual culture. And so museums are a really interesting space to think about that in France because they are so closely tied to the state's apparatus. Most museums are public museums. At least for the national museums, museum employees are employees of the state. So there's this really close um, connection between museum institutions and state institutions. Um, and I think because I kind of got into visual culture first through a literary training and background, I think I'm often bringing questions or approaches that come from a practice of reading texts into my analysis of visual culture. And so this first iteration that I referenced earlier, I think shows that even more. So it came about when this art collective and magazine called Africada, that's run by Pascal Obolo in France, um, was invited by the Saint-Georges Pompidou, so a contemporary art museum in Paris, to take over a gallery for a 3-day kind of collective exhibit. And Pascal was given, complete freedom to invite whoever she wanted into this kind of taking over of the museum. And she knew a little bit about my research, so she kind of told me, you want to give a talk about your research or propose something else? And I really wanted to push myself to not give like an academic talk, but to really experiment with research creation and with collaborative thinking and collaborative making. So my first idea, since I had been documenting all of these museum spaces in France and had been thinking about translation, was to invite Cosmo to work with me on this. And he was in Michigan, I think, at the time, or at
Yeah.
any rate in the US. I was in France. So we're like, how can we collaborate on this? And so what we came up with is I translated text labels, as I mentioned, from French into English. I sent them to Cosmo, who had not been to these museums, had not seen these objects, and he created drawings or collages based on those translations with only kind of the title of uh, the text label incorporated into the drawing. Um, and eventually, when we exhibited in the space, we did put the drawings next to the text label that they referred to, but we printed out the labels that I kind of reformatted to resemble what they had looked like in the museum. Um, did a gesso transfer to copy them to another page. So we again had this sort of repetition and transposition happening. And through this process, we're able to, that just makes, not the full ink transfers. So there's holes, you know, um, there's noise, let's say it gets messy, you can't read it fully clearly. So we had this juxtaposition and we were thinking of um, very much of this idea of what does the museum say and how does that inform what you see? And so if we kind of try to separate out what the museum says, what other things become visible. So that's a little bit about our first collaboration, which left us with a lot of questions and a lot of things we weren't fully satisfied with, which the second project let us explore. But I want to let Cosmo answer a bit before I get into that.
Yeah. And so this was also another great moment for me to take the things that I was thinking about within my own practice and then approach them in a completely new way, responding purely to text. But I was also very keen that I wanted to draw on references that were within contemporary um, vernacular. So, for instance, the one that we're looking at now, I'm using the awning of an African braiding shop that you could find in any urban city, both here in the US or in Europe, to then think through, you know, the the translation that I was given, um, and just to kind of use that this as a way of answering the question that's in the chat. At the point at which Abigail approached me with this project, my drawing practice was and continues to be heavily figurative, but I was starting to wrestle with what now I describe as a contentious relationship with figuration. And I was starting to think through ways of this question of fugitivity, what gets lost in translation, is that are those moments and gaps in translation a generative space, and so this was a nice way of dovetailing into and beginning further exploration in ways that I wouldn't have done on my own. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing some of that earlier work. It's incredible to see. And it's like, I don't know, I think there's just such a beautiful trajectory of what you were both doing and the kind of like dialogue I was just like thinking, I'm like, oh, I'm talking about the distance you have now. And I'm like, oh, you had a much
Yeah.
larger distance
Yeah, it was much like,
before
yeah,
with
yeah,
Act One. That's
yeah,
incredible. And that investment too in thinking about translation in this way that's, in terms of like what's gets lost, what's excessive, yeah, what is totally, yeah, just what is intranslatable or untranslatable. And the kind of like form of grief that comes along with that of just like, okay, well, we will not necessarily, be able to hold on to that. So I
yeah.
just I really appreciate this sort of like dwelling on translation. Um, Okay, so I'm going to actually delve into, I had prepared a list of questions that Abigail and Cosmo are aware of. So I'm going to actually go to the second question because you were talking a bit with the slides on annotation and citation. And so
Mhm.
I think this is such a big part of as Cosmo put it, sort of sharing the process-based portions with the collages, and then as well as the citations and the annotations with this sort of semi-transparent paper. And I think there's part of it is one, firstly, like I want to acknowledge the generosity of sharing process. And for me, when I am in an exhibition space that does do that, I always deeply appreciate sort of seeing these iterations or ways that things feel um, raw or like there is a just such yeah, generosity that I think is involved in that, and I want to first acknowledge how much I appreciate the work that you've done by sharing that. Yeah, so more specifically in terms of citation and annotation, so I'm kind of curious about the kinds of references you make because they do span many disciplines and fields. And how is the centrality of citation and annotation core to your practice? And you can think about it collaboratively or respectively. And how do these forms of engagement help constitute this as a research creation project? Because I know that's a term that some people are like, oh, like, do I use it? How does it, what is constituted by it? And yeah, and how this kind of like very acute forms of engagement that you are doing in this project are also, the investment in making that opaque is very interesting to me. So yeah, yeah, question on annotation and citation.
To answer that question, I'm going to jump up a bit around between oscillate between my practice and this collaboration. Um, citation and annotations, or more specifically, annotations became more prominent within my own personal practice around 2020. Particularly, I was living in Atlanta, and the social and racial uprising agitations that was happening there, and thinking through it, I found that I started actually annotating in the margins of my drawings and leaving those bare and just kind of being very raw and open in how I was thinking through a moment or connecting it to what I was reading and all of that stuff. As it pertains to here, I liken this show to if one, if you walk into a museum space or opening, I feel like I can always tell the artist because they're looking at, if for instance, if it's a painting, they're looking at the corner of the painting to see like what are the layers, how is this person doing that, and I feel like this show for me is turning the painting so we're looking at the corner, so all the layers are kind of raw and open to the viewer, and there's a certain level of vulnerability to that. And even the act of having the annotations, Abby's annotations on top of the translation, but from a distance, the annotations are what we're seeing first. It's there's a great deal of vulnerability to that. But I think Abigail can talk more.
Yeah, I mean, I think um, to kind of answer my broader practice, I like I've always been interested in a lot of different readings that are coming from really a range of disciplines. Like I was never very good at finding the sources that are speaking directly to the like object or site or text that I'm analyzing. I'm always bringing in these readings that are talking about something else, but in my head, I see a potential connection. Um, and I notice that when I write, like what I like the best is if I can really take the words of someone else and put them in my text next to mine. I can't always do that because of academic norms and all of these things. Um, but I think I find research meaningful when I feel like it's letting me have a conversation with several different people. And citation is one way to do that. And it's also one way to keep me honest. I think in university research, we are very much taught to have original ideas and claim authority and show that we're so smart and brilliant and have thought of this thing that no one has ever thought of before. But that's not my experience at all. My experience
Mm-hmm.
is if I have an interesting thought, it's because I spoke or read to a bunch of other people and they've helped me
Mm-hmm.
formulate something that's maybe not that different from what they're saying. I'm just slightly changing it or applying it to slightly different context. So in a way, citation uh, for me is a kind of ethical practice. And again, I'm not the only one who's talked about this. Catherine Patrick, Sarah Ahmed, like there's so many people who have spoken about this already. And so what I liked about this research creation process is that we had the space, as Cosmo said, to bring that to the forefront. And I love that metaphor of kind of flipping the painting. So you're seeing like all of the layers that went into this. I think also because, as we briefly mentioned, we started doing the research and kind of filming the space in 2018, 2019. The show didn't open till 2024. So there was this like 5-year conversation where we kept reading, kept, talking about these ideas without actually making the work. And so it felt like I'd accumulated a lot of that in a way to other thinkers. And I want to think more about the difference between citation and annotation. And are they maybe kind of reverse processes? Like when I annotate, is it kind of like a reverse citation? I'm placing myself into another text, the work of someone else, maybe,
Mhm.
um, but yeah, I think I hadn't thought about it in terms of vulnerability, but I think that's also a really interesting thing to bring up because it did feel like it sort of felt like a risk making this project because we knew we were showing something that was our process of thinking, and not necessarily something that's finished. And then I think I'm also, when I read a text that is generous in their citations, I'm so grateful because it gives me new things to read. And so I kind of wanted to reproduce that experience in our exhibition so that someone could come in and leave with kind of a toolkit of if there were things that spoke to them, they could at least see where we were, who we were in conversation with.
That's really beautiful. Thank you both for sort of um, yeah, generously responding to this question because I do think that semi-transparent layering, the way that the work of, annotation there is, it's playing with opacity, but and for me, like opacity has, it's multi-pronged, and I think at your show, it's so like capacious and just like generous in the way that you're sort of very materially using it. But part of how I'm thinking of it, at least how I define it, is, from a genealogy coming out of Glissant, um, as protective, right? And I think there's this way that um, the way that for that particular part of the project, that layering is protection. And it's asking this very like, it's a question, or the set of questions seem to come out of a really genuine care for what is on the page and kind of an engagement that I think that for me, it's also like showing this kind of like the ethics of like how we relate to whether it is these different forms of writing or also what it is we do for each other. And there's just something very beautiful about that. So that's not a question, but just for me, like
Thanks.
just a really a deep appreciation for the kind of like ethics of the project itself. Um, Okay, so for the sake of time, I'm going to try to get through some of the questions, but I kind of want to like do the kind of more coverage part of it. So maybe a question um, on the museum. So maybe we can talk a bit about the role of the museum, the way that you're engaging the MAAOA, and so specifically, right, how does the museum offer both a point of departure and a site of critique in the catalog? How does the project imagine and understand the coloniality of the museum space broadly? Not just a site of critique, but something to actively be undone. And I'm going to actually, as you know, this is like question 4. I'm going to ask question 5 with it so that we can kind of think about the sort of like these larger senses of the museum. So earlier, Abigail, you mentioned the museum and the state and thinking about these institutions together as part of your research in general. So part of what I'm thinking too then with the catalog, right, is that if we're thinking about the museum and then also this question of captivity and also I think someone in the chat mentioned, right, fugitivity, right? So in relation to, on the one hand, Black study, and then on the other hand, the museum space, right? So I'm thinking of Nicole Fleetwood and her note in the book Marking Time as a way of considering the museum as upholding virtue, held against the prison, as relegating deviance out of sight. Is there a possibility that, and this is, we were talking about this earlier, I was like, these are leading questions, so my apologies. You're both considering the museum as a site of captivity, upholding colonial histories as honorable. If so, how might the museum then offer a place in which theft is considered a virtue, and what are the implications of that? This is like two giant questions that are full of other questions in them. But in terms of thinking about the museum as a site of critique, but also something to actively be undone, and is also thinking about captivity, theft. Yeah, so a little bit about that giant question.
Yeah, I might start by saying that I really love this question that or the way that you formulated and kind of drew my attention to this idea of museums as a place for upholding virtue and how one of those virtues is theft, because that's absolutely in line with a lot of the thinking I've been doing around this conversation of restitution and repatriation and kind of the way stories are told about how the objects, beings, and ancestors that are being exhibited got there in the first place. And so one of the things I did when I annotated those text labels is I would circle the names that appeared, like the proper names that appeared in these labels. And by doing that, I noticed that it was often the name of donors or collectors who are often European donors or collectors, and just the way that the museum kind of valorizes that act and being like, this is something worthy of being named. This person, collected this object or gave it to the museum, but how and why did they have or think they have the right to collect it, or how, you know, materially, how did it happen? Um, so I think it's a really useful frame, the way you phrased it, of thinking about how museums um, uh, are sites of virtue, and some of those virtues are colonial ones. Um, I I'm gonna pause there to let Cosmo talk a bit, and then I might go back to other parts of the question.
Yeah, and also thinking about the museum in Marseille and the history of it, I think one of the really pivotal moments for me in this project was um, once we realized that it was also a site for colonial troops, and then it was also a, an institution. So there were all of these layers of captivity and conscription that were being embodied within the collection itself. So while thinking through your question, I felt like this project and this collection kind of embodied that tension that you're speaking of. And for me, the question of fugitivity then became a response to, to these kind of complexities.
Yeah, I mean, I think um, something that this project is helping me think through is the way museums confuse care with captivity. So, they say they're taking care of these objects. You'll often hear curators talk about how the Latin root of curate is curare, which means to cure, to take care of, to heal, and yet these spaces are often that care only happens if you assent or are conscripted into captivity. And so I think part of the undoing of the coloniality of museums is figuring out how do we take apart care and captivity? How can these institutions, can these institutions become sites where care does not require captivity, and where maybe presence doesn't require ownership, where, these collections can exist not as property, but as something else. Um, and I don't think that's something we do in this project. I think it's a project that critiques and interrogates the museum. I don't think it takes the step of undoing the museum, which is necessary work, but not something that we're quite doing here. I think we get closer maybe than in the first iteration, which, as you noticed, was still very much in this dynamic of the relationship between text and image, still very ocular centric, still, really emphasizing sight, which is something that has been upheld as by the museum also as virtue and also as kind of the a prerequisite for knowledge. And I think we're interested in thinking about how knowledge can be formed without relying on sight. Again, this idea of opacity, of things that obscure and protect, but yet knowledge and meaning is created nevertheless. Um, but yeah, so in this act, we try to bring in, sound and tactility and different movements more explicitly, but I wouldn't say that we, you know, do the museum in any way. But we're hopefully asking questions that might prepare for that work. Yeah, let me pause there. You go
Yeah,
ahead, Cosmo.
and it's an ongoing project too. So this is Act Two, but there will be other acts. And as Abigail was talking about this question of this conflation of care with captivity, what was interesting when we were in Marseille was that I think the Felwin SARS report had just come out. So this question of restitution was happening. And uh, a rebuttal was that, oh, but you can't send this back because they won't be taken care of in the ways these objects have now become accustomed to, or the right ways in which um, to care for these objects. And it was interesting to see how this question of care was being weaponized as a way of justifying the maintaining of these, what frankly are colonial collections.
Yeah, and maybe the last very brief thing to go back to Cosmo's point about fugitivity. I think that's also why we were interested in fugitivity, because fugitivity is something that exists within captivity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Within these structures. It's not necessarily um it operates when you're in a state of confinement in some way, and allows for moments of escape and connection and of thinking otherwise. So I think that's why we were drawn to that term.
Thank you both for, I mean, I also wrote down that there will be other acts in all caps, so I'm like, Cosmo and Abigail, that's a promise. Because it was like one of the first questions I had was like, do you plan to continue? And so now I'm like, okay, I wrote it down. It's in all caps. It's gonna happen. So I'm going to basically do a combination of the question I hadn't earlier and then combine it with the last question. And then I would also ask, because we do want to end on time as just a promise to everyone and to also taking breaks at 3:30. And so I will ask this sort of last set of questions. And then if those of you in the audience, we're grateful for your attention. But if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or, sort of come up with them as we sort of wrap up with our set of questions so that we can at least have 10 minutes for a sort of Q&A moment. So please feel free to put that in the chat. Um, so one thing I want to sort of like center, right, is the way that the project is very much, and I think you were mentioning sort of thinking about the debts and through citation, through annotation, and the kind of like I really appreciated the sort of notes about what it means to build on particular fields and disciplines and what that means in terms of like also understanding our contributions to any field or discipline as something that is Doesn't have to be necessarily like, you know, new, original, all of these words that people sort of expect. But so in terms of the way that this project in particular centers both study of the Black diaspora or the African diaspora, and is also indebted to Black study as a form of global study. So thinking about this project and your work in relation to such fields and critical formations, and then also for me, we've been talking about opacity. The project is literally uses it in its description, but thinking also about opacity as something that comes out of Glissant has a very sort of like anti-colonial genealogy and a Black anti-colonial genealogy and what that means. Because I think at the forefront of the most robust studies of opacity are Black theorists, Black feminist theorists, Black anti-colonial theorists. And so thinking along the lines of opacity, more specifically, the way that this project uses abstraction, and not in a way that's, at all like, it's a very generative use of abstraction, right? What it means to make opaque relations between a post-colonial people and the haunting of both colonial past and present. Um, Furthermore, how do our acts of looking necessitate opacity as a strategy to viewership and consumption? So, in other words, let's riff on opacity and then also think about it in relation to Black study, anti-colonial study, feminist study.
Um, Thanks, Balbir, for again such a rich set of questions. I think uh, so. Again, in terms of my practice, kind of entering entering research through this question of what are the afterlives of colonialism in in sort of the French Francophone context. It very quickly brings the question of African diaspora and colonialism in Africa because that was such an important part of the French Empire. Um, and so I think, to me, pretty quickly it became very evident that I couldn't rely only on post-colonial theory, but had to read more broadly to include thinkers from what's called African studies, from Black study, who are also thinking about colonialism and its afterlives. So that's kind of how I entered and began engaging in those fields. And I think um, that is very present in the project. In the citations, there's a lot of kind of canonical or important thinkers from those fields. Mm, but in the project, I'm maybe displacing them to start thinking more specifically about what that means for museum contexts. Um, which I think we're seeing a lot more of now, like with Nicole Fleetwood and Marking Time, which you already cited. Christina Sharp's Ordinary Notes actually kind of references museums and repatriation in some of these discussions, but I think they were kind of two very not overlapping fields. And so part of the challenge in this project was kind of how do I draw from both? How do I draw from museum studies and what they're saying? And how do I draw from kind of like, Francophone post-colonial studies? And how am I bringing in um, African studies and Black diaspora? But I think it also shows the richness of the field of Black study and Black studies in that there's so much being said there that's incredibly generative for these other spaces. Um, and then again, I want to sort of like remind everyone that France is so much part of the African diaspora as well, which is something that often gets lost in the way it's taught in, I'd say, the US. I see that for now, maybe Canada. Um, but that's often lost. And so sort of seeing all of these fields as a continuum or as being in conversation implicitly, if not explicitly, is something that this project might be allowing me to do.
Yeah, I think, Abigail did a really good job of responding to that question. And, I would say for my own practice is a similar case of um, pulling a lot from writers in Black studies to kind of think through these questions that I'm grappling with, um, whether it's displacement, fugitivity, migration. So it just was a natural part of my artistic practice to be pulling from these thinkers to sometimes articulate in words what I have been grappling with visually or materially. And
Thank you both for your such generative and generous thinkers. And I want to open up, since we have about 9 minutes, if there are questions, you can put it in the chat. You can also ask it out loud. We're happy to field any questions from folks.
And maybe as people are gathering their thoughts or typing up questions, I realized we kind of touched less on opacity in the last in our last response. And I think I mean, Cosmo, I'd love to hear you talk about kind of opacity and looking relations or relationships of witnessing, because I know that's something that starts to structure your practice.
mhm.
But yeah, maybe start with that and then I'll add some thoughts.
Yeah. I think a lot about what is the responsibility of the viewer or the witness. I mean, I think the idea of a witness as opposed to a viewer inherently has more responsibility attached to it. Um, what does it mean to hold something that I'm viewing, and do I have a responsibility back to it? And that is how I feel when I walk through any of these collections within a museum space. I am witnessing not just the theft, but the the history of captivity, the its cultural context before captivity. Does it have a cultural context now within the space of captivity, outside of service to empire or what have you? Um, and then these are questions I grapple with within my own work, and I find opacity as a generative space to think through that. Thinking a lot of Glissana and how it's okay for there to be these moments of loss of in translation, and yeah, I think we do have.
We have a question, yes, in the
Yeah.
chat. Um, and I mean, I'm going to read the question. I do want to
Okay.
also just sort of mention too, because I think earlier you were both talking about the way that you're trying to move away from ocular centrism, like the way
Yeah.
that you're trying to like, I mean, I'm
hmm
thinking of like the shimmering screen.
Yeah.
I'm also thinking about the audio aspects and the sort of like different portions of the project. And I'm,
hmm
the way that you're sort of like engaging multiple senses. And I
hmm
think there is a way that like hapticality and tactility and all of that, I think it does really, I'm like trying to not say shine through because I'm thinking of the shimmering screen
Yeah.
and I'm like, I can't help it.
hmm
But really thinking about that multisensorial is also a strategy of opacity, right? That part of it
hmm
is like,
Yeah.
it is a movement away from sight or
hmm
the use of vision
Yeah.
to consume is also a way to decenter that kind of
Yeah.
ocular centrism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also coming from a painting background. I was trained as a painter. It takes a lot of undoing to get to that point. And I view both my larger practice and this collaboration as an incremental step towards that. The curtains being an example of that. It requires an engagement. It requires you either walking through it and having your body create a wake within the image, disrupting the image momentarily. In this case, in order to see what is being projected more clearly. And sometimes there's text being projected too, which is completely rendered illegible because of the repetition and doubling that happens as it filters through the curtain. That requires a tactile sensation. You're touching the material in a way that we're often told within a museum space, you can't touch that. You must only look. Within my own practice, there have been exhibitions in which I've utilized smell, oftentimes pungent smells, to activate the space and other things.
For that.
Yeah.
Is it okay if I jump in and read the question?
Yeah.
And if
Sure,
okay,
yeah.
yeah. So Chris asked, and thank you, Chris, for the question. Do you think captivity is also a state of mind you could get trapped in a colonial sense too? So big question. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different ways to understand this question. One is kind of with this idea of colonizing the mind. So, yes, there's ways in which kind of colonial ideologies and ways of being and thinking and doing become internalized and capture our attention and ways of thinking and feeling and make it harder to imagine other things. I'm also thinking of it in the sense that something we didn't want to do is only look at these collections through the lens of captivity. So not only be like, oh, these are, stolen objects and now they're captured and now they're victims, to say it that way. Like, yes, there was a harm that was done. Yes, there is theft. Yes, there is appropriation, but there's something else that still is there. And that's one of the reasons why sort of translation as a way of speculation, of creating alternative narratives, of creating new meanings, of an excess of meaning was interesting to us, to not only be approaching them through the lens of captivity, but through the lens of like generation and creation and regeneration. And we have another question for Cosmo.
Yeah, so I'll read this. This is from my dear friend Sue. Sue wrote, Cosmo and other people doing artistic research and other smart people in the room. I teach at an art school and my students see themselves as artists. In this context, I've noticed a strange move in formalizing opacity, perhaps the aestheticization of opacity. I love how me continually grounds opacity in Black study. I'm wondering if Cosmo and others have anything to say about producing work against aestheticization.
Yeah, I also teach in an art school, and I have noticed this kind of gravitation towards glissant, but I view it as a response to hypervisibility that I think we've gone through a moment of like hypervisibility and haven't been critical enough of that hypervisibility. And I think what we're seeing is particularly students responding to that and figuring out ways of carving out spaces of protection, and the very nature of any kind of artistic practice, but particularly art school, is that you're going to have these moments, and the market, I mean, you're going to have these moments of this complete aestheticization of it, and then you're going to have a pushback against it. So I think we're in this weird moment of, yes, there's this kind of aestheticization of opacity, but then there's going to be a pushback against it. From within my own practice, I try to pull from the ways in which I have, within a cultural context of Jamaica, seen the ways in which opacity is naturally ingrained within a culture, and try to use those moments within my practice, but also recognizing that there are things that you can read, for instance, like the curtain and all of that, as a form of visually legible representation of opacity. There are other ways in which the work is operating in opacity that I'm not being explicit. And if you know, you know. If you don't, you know, you miss it. That's fine. Um, yeah.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think this is such a um yeah, such an important sort of like way that it's a response, it's a reaction, but it's something that does feel it feels important and something that I think like marking a particular kind of like
Mm-hmm.
moment
Yeah.
artistically or aesthetically.
Yeah.
So Sue is also confounded by the decontextualized reading of Poetics Revelation. I feel
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
We also have another question. Can I ask for 4 more minutes yeah? Is that
Yeah.
okay? Okay, perfect. So Corinne asks, I have a million questions, and I'm so inspired by your discussion, but I'll ask one quick one. Were there any gestures on the museum in Marseille's part to acknowledge the complicated ethics of curating these objects, as is sometimes the case in American museums? Are you possibly planning to looking at curating practices in other countries?
So no, there were not. Short answer is no. In one conversation with the museum director, she very much wanted to point out that they were one of the first museums that did actually start some repatriation of human remains, which was kind of one of the first types of repatriation that was allowed in France. So, she was kind of very quick to tell us that, they were doing it before the Musée du Quai Branly was doing it. So there was some thinking, but nothing in the exhibition space. It was just the wall text that was written, I think, in the early 1990s. Maybe there was a remodel in the 2000s. I can't remember. And nothing that would acknowledge that. We haven't been back in a while. I don't know if things have changed. I also remember seeing a temporary exhibit being announced a couple years ago that was about kind of circulation of cultural objects. I don't know if in that temporary exhibition they addressed some of that. Um, but no. And then looking at curating practices in other countries, I think for now our um, future acts will still kind of have France as an anchoring point, even if the creations kind of will take many shapes and forms. Just because I think, and I mean, we'll see what happens, but I am interested in trying to understand if there's something specific given the kind of social, cultural, and legal context of France and how that plays out in the exhibition space, which also kind of, you know, ties to this question of opacity and sometimes perhaps the risks of opacity. I think there's some resistance to opacity in contexts like France, where colonial amnesia is very strong, and there's this feeling of people are not even talking. It's shifted a lot in recent years, but people are not talking about colonial history. They're not talking about the intersections of colonization and slavery. Discussions about race are so fraught um, that there's maybe a first reaction of going towards kind of more visibility and more kind of explicit representation. And so I think another question for us is what, you know, how does opacity function as a strategy, depending on the cultural context and the temporal context? What is the possibility of opacity now versus 5 years ago versus 5 years in the future?
Well, I wanted to also, yeah, I think this last note you just made, Abigail, is so important because it is like something that within the context of North America, like there is so much like I'm thinking of the Going Dark exhibition and
Yeah.
like what
Hmm.
was
Yeah.
done with
Yeah.
opacity there, and
Hmm.
then like the as you put it, right, the risks of opacity in places like France where you risk people deliberately and maybe joyfully not remembering, right? If you aren't necessarily clear about colonialism and being very clear about speaking to, um, Black people, North African people, like there is something really, yeah, like it is something that we have to be so clear and mindful about in terms of like just like geographic context and space and sort of acknowledging the very strong risks of not doing that kind of work in yeah being clear about the history, right, and the legacy and the way it haunts the and animates the present. I think now is a good place to wrap up, and I want to thank uh, everyone for attending and staying with us, and for the
Thank you.
brilliant questions that we got. It's really, really wonderful to sort of have this kind of engagement. I want to just please express my thanks to Abigail and Cosmo and just a round of applause for just such a brilliant project, such generous conversation, description, and the kind of like labor that is involved. And to also just say, I can't wait for X3 and I'm ready for the next iteration of a conversation. And yeah, and I'm so grateful to be in conversation with you both. And
Thank you so
obviously, it's the
much.
start of many, many more. And I will say, I wish everyone a lovely Friday and a lovely weekend. And I will also note the Labs Nuzzer speaker series is out. So our next event will be February 20th on the Concordia campus in Montreal. Thank you all. Thank you, Abigail. Thank you, Cosmo, for everything
Thank you.
today. So grateful. And thank you, everyone, for showing up and showing up. Take good care.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for showing up. Thank you,
Thank
Balbir,
you.
so much. This was very rich.
Yeah,
Mm,
thank you so much.
Same. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Mhm.
Right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.